yeah, also yes.
Some names.
Do you mind if Tom is there?
I don't mind.
As long as he's quiet.
Out of the picture, please.
I see the attendee number climbing, so we're not quite in broadcast mode.
Yeah.
It'll be about 15 seconds.
We're not there yet. Okay.
Yeah. But
Point of correction, you guys are broadcasting, so the attendees who are in can see you.
Okay.
right, those who can see us, we're waiting 15 seconds for all of the attendees to join us. So bear with us. Welcome. Okay, it's 11:31, so I think we've got all the attendees in. So let's get started. First, I'll welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today to spend the next 75 minutes of Reunions 2020 with myself, Kathryn Reimann, and best-selling author Josh Hammer, also class of 79. Josh is joining us from Berlin, and he is going to talk about being a best-selling author in the category of adventure nonfiction. Which
that's my own made-up category. That's not any Amazon or, that's non-existent except here.
And you know, I'm not sure it gives you enough credit, Josh, because actually you write about very serious issues like the appropriation and preservation of culture and heritage and the environment and terrorism in failed countries. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to you. And why don't you tell us a bit about your background and your embrace of adventure nonfiction?
Okay, so after Princeton, I'll compress 40 years in a few sentences. After some sort of, my writing runs in my family. My dad was a journalist of the New York Times and wrote books, so there's a genetic continuity there. I ended up, after a few sort of meandering years traveling, living abroad, ended up at Newsweek in 1988. In 1992, I went abroad and I was a foreign correspondent all over the world for, so I really did. Took me a while to kind of get to the place where I felt like I really wanted to be. My first job was Nairobi bureau chief for Newsweek in 92 to 96, and that started me off on this 15-year freelance, bureau chief, series of bureau chief jobs for Newsweek, and ending up as a writer, correspondent at large around 2005 after a Neiman Fellowship at Harvard. And in 2006, I left Newsweek and did something that I've always wanted. I had always, for quite a while, dreamed of doing, which is becoming an independent author, writer, long-form narrative magazine writer and author, full-time, just to kind of get out of the newsweekly life. So I started doing that. I had already built up a bunch of freelance connections, started writing for Outside, Smithsonian, The Nation, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books. I really kept extremely busy running, based in Berlin and just running all over the place for many years through really from like 2006 to 2014. I was doing an exhaustive amount of travel, writing these long form pieces at the rate of about one a month. And then that led to my first book, not my first book, but my first book that anybody actually paid attention to. Badass Librarians of Timbuktu in 2016 that came out. And that had a sort of an unexpected success. And I began to think more and more about trying to do this like full time. You get older and you don't want to be running around the world all, really, I mean, frankly, being in my 50s, I was getting up there even then, but then you hit 60, it's like really enough. So the idea was to try to segue completely into book writing, and it's as any author will tell you, it's it's hard to it's really hard to make a living doing it. I can't say that I'm there, but I mean, I'd still have to kind of mix up magazine journalism and book writing, to varying degrees. Yeah. Although Badass gave me some time to allowed me to slow down a bit.
So we're going to talk a lot more about that, and I've got some questions for Josh for the next about 45 minutes, and after that, we'd like to make this interactive and open it up to questions from the audience. So I'd like to ask you to use your chat function, and also please upvote the questions, which will help me in pitching the most popular questions to Josh. So as we move on, before we really get into the discussion of your craft, can we hear a little bit about both Badass Librarians and then also your most recent book, The Falcon Thief?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you have a few pictures to share, so you can really give our audience a sense of what
I would be glad to. I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to see these shots. Never did determine that. But anyway, let's start with Badass Librarians of Timbuktu. Oh, there we go. Was a story that kind of was a book that came out of many years of being fascinated by Mali, Sahel country, one of the poorest in the world, but also I think one of the most culturally rich countries, and really a very mystical place. I started visiting there when I was a Newsweek correspondent. Let's slow down. Let me give you the cue. Yeah, back to him. I started visiting there as a Newsweek correspondent, made my first trip there in 1995, got fascinated by Timbuktu, in the really remote corner of Mali, remote corner of the Sahel. In 2006, after I'd gone freelance, I went up there to write about this kind of rediscovery of ancient manuscripts that had been distributed through the desert and it ended up being collected and amassed in libraries in Timbuktu. And this was the fellow who I met at that time. This is Abdelkader Haidara. He was a librarian and intellectual and just a sort of a very effervescent, gregarious fellow, dominating personality. He had taken charge of this manuscript recovery effort. Let's go to the next shot. In the city of Timbuktu. This is a typical ancient, one of the oldest neighborhoods of the city. Obviously, no great shakes. I mean, it was, there was a time in the 18th, 19th century when the various explorers wanted to get there, heard rumors of it being paved with gold, and got there after crossing the desert, and this is what they found. So this was Abdelkader's turf. He amassed all these libraries. Let's get to the next shot. This is the typical of a kind of incredibly beautiful works that he amassed. So there's 300,000 of them in Timbuktu during a time of great cultural revival, really fantastic stuff. Both this, I believe, is a Quran, but you had religious works, you had secularized works as well, including poetry, love poetry, history, sex guides, astronomy, works about medicine. So it was a really flowering period for Timbuktu. It harkened back to the time when Timbuktu was the center, was one of the great intellectual and economic centers of Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries. So basically, then in 2012, to make a long story short, Al-Qaeda invaded the north of Mali. This had been sort of an outgrowth of a long simmering Islamist movement in the region, combined with the Arab Spring, which destabilized much of the area, including Libya. These guys went into Libyan armories, got themselves weapons, then swept across Mali, which was very poor, very vulnerable, very weak army, managed to seize control of 60% of Mali in a matter of weeks. This is a remnant of one of the Al-Qaeda flags that was flying around the north for about 9 months as they instituted Sharia law and began threatening to to destroy these manuscripts. So basically, the story that evolves from there is Abdelkader's organizing a clandestine effort to take all of these manuscripts. I forget what we've got next, but let's see what the next picture is. That's a little premature. Can we get back to the Al-Qaeda shot? But yeah, there we go. Let's freeze on that for a minute. So basically, Abdelkader organized this incredible smuggling operation to get all of these manuscripts into metal chests or wooden chests, and then stick them in cars and boats and smuggle them out of jihadist territory in the north into government territory where they would be safe. It was an incredibly secretive operation that lasted from about August 2012 to January 2013, when the French military invaded northern Mali to get rid of the jihadis. And then you had like true chaos there. By that time, almost all the manuscripts were safely out of the city, but the ones that were left in the sort of the last throes of exploration, let's take a next shot, Neil. Before they left, they took every manuscript they could find in the city that had not, Abdul Qadir and his guys had not managed to evacuate, and created a huge funeral, a huge pyre and bonfire, and burned them all. So the ending, it was sad and tragic. I mean, these were ancient volumes, 600, 700 years old, the cultural patrimony of the city, of the country. But this represented about 15,000. They lost about 15,000 works and managed to save about 300,000. And it really did end up vindicating Abdul Qadir's fears and effort to save everything he could, because had he not, there would have a good chance that Mali and the world, Timbuktu, Mali, the world would have lost, you know, a lot of great cultural treasures. Last shot, I think, from that group. Yeah, this is just same. This is a government library, and this was I visited Timbuktu as I was doing the reporting, and this was in the government library. This guy was one of the local scholars, kind of looking at the remains of the destroyed manuscripts, but you know, but was also somewhat heartened by the fact that most of them have been salvaged. So yeah, that was kind of that's kind of the story. It's I forgot about this shot. This is my one of my last glimpses of Timbuktu after the jihadis had been driven out into the desert by the French. A UN peacekeeping force basically came in to the city, and this is from one side of the Niger River to the other side. I guess I was heading into Timbuktu. These guys were heading out on R&R, it's like a Senegalese force, I think. And they remain the sort of last bastion of the security in Timbuktu in the north, which remains a real no man's land. And that's why the manuscripts have not been returned to Timbuktu, but remain in the south, in government territory, where they're being very well kept and digitized, and perhaps one day they will be returned to the libraries where they belong. And that's the story.
It's an amazing story. And you know, I found it interesting reading both books that Abdul Qadir is such an admirable figure, and his life's work is his obsession. Now, your next book, The Falcon Thief, also has a central character who has an obsession, but is really the anti-hero. Why don't you tell us a bit about it?
So this was a story that really came in a very different way from Badass Librarians, in that I really stumbled across a news clip when I was in London about this career criminal who had just escaped from Brazil. He had jumped bail in Brazil, where he was about to be sent to jail for 7 years or something like that for stealing rare albino peregrine falcons from nests in Patagonia. He was on his way from, he had come from Chilean Patagonia to Brazil, and he was on his way to Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, to take these eggs, live eggs, and sell them to presumably to Arab. It was presumed. I mean, this is not a fact. We all know it's fact, but of course he never would admit it. Presumably to sell them to wealthy Arab sheikhs for the sport for their falconry, either for hunting or racing falcons. So this guy had gone on the lam. It turned out that he had, according to this article, a long career as an egg thief around the world, in stealing eggs from nests in remote corners of the planet, and taking them smuggling them across many borders to the United Arab Emirates, to these billionaire clients of his. And so I was intrigued by this. This had a lot of elements that grabbed me immediately. This kind of underworld, falconry, environmental depredation, Middle Eastern elements, like sort of globe-trotting criminal in a very esoteric world. And so I was instantly intrigued and began to dig around and basically unravel his story. And this particular shot is of a, I mean, the story kind of got wilder the deeper I got into it. This was an expedition that he and an accomplice took up to near the Arctic Circle in the most northern corner of Quebec to go after gyrfalcons, these huge raptors. What's of particular interest to them were these white gyrfalcons, pure white. This is not a pure white one, but you know, it's a gray-white morph. But they would raid these nests by helicopter because these eggs are very difficult to reach on cliffs. Either you rappel down to get them, or in the case of these guys who had all this, they were bankrolled by the sheikhs. Perfect timing. I didn't even have to cue you there. They used these helicopters. Actually used a helicopter piloted by this character, Jeffrey Landrum's former war buddy from Rhodesia in the 70s. And they would just sweep down on these cliffs, and Jeff would dangle from a rope and reach in and grab these things. I mean, it was really a paramilitary operation. So I unraveled this guy's career. Let's go to another. And traveled all around the world pursuing his life. Including stops in the Middle East, where I was immediately sort of caught up in the incredible, lavish attention that these billionaires bestowed on their beloved falcons. And this is the veterinary center of the Crown Prince of Dubai, the son of Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, who has this elaborate center for racing, training falcons, breeding them, operating on them, replacing their feathers when they have accidents in the air. Let's take another shot. This is the Sheikh's training ground, where he's training these birds to fly at high speeds across these desert tracts. And I think we have one more shot. And this is what's driving this. Most of what's driving this illegal falcon trade is these falcon races, in which these wealthy royal families put up $15–20 million, and they and their buddies bet and take these prize birds. You know, the money really doesn't mean anything to them. It's really the prestige thing, is receiving these trophies that they go for. And so they're willing to do everything they can, including breaking the law and sending off people like Jeffrey Landrum to pursue these wild birds in the bush, in the remote corners of the planet. So because they believe that the wild birds are the ones who that are the most that are the fastest, and natural selection has created these super birds out in the wild. Whereas the captive bred ones are not as valuable, those are the legitimate ones, but they disdain them somewhat and really want the wild ones. So it's created this entire black market. So the book was really kind of, as I said, a narrative about Landrum's life, how he evolved into this global smuggler, who he was smuggling for, and how he was finally brought down by this wildlife cop named Andy McWilliam, a Liverpool street cop, beat cop, who turned into the country's foremost pursuer of ornithological criminals. So a kind of catch me if you can in the ornithological world. And I'll let it go. I'll stop there. I think that's our last shot. Yeah. So two very different stories, both had, a certain amount of, the reason I say adventure nonfiction is because they did require, in addition to, a lot of archival work to sort of understand this stuff, the context of it, a lot of legwork in fairly hard to get to and adventurous places.
So let's talk about a little bit about how you know the story is going to work as a book.
I don't know. No, I didn't know. No, I mean, Badass Librarians, I knew, because I had been following that story, as I said, since the 90s, 2006. I'd made my first trip there. I'd been there a couple other times. I was there for when the French invaded Mali in 2013 to liberate the country from the jihadists. I was there. Abdul Qadir, although I didn't know him very well, I had a sense he had a good story to tell. So I was pretty confident going into that there was a great tale to, you know, I mean, jihadists, war, manuscripts, a lot of elements there, you know. And it turned out, as I sat down with Abdulkader Haidara when I began working on this, and sat with him for like 14 hours and in a hotel over a period of weeks, I'm listening to him tell me his life story, that I realized that the back, in addition to all the kind of craziness and tension and war and saving of the manuscripts, this rescue effort, he also had this extraordinary life and extraordinary backstory that I had really been unaware of. And he's a great raconteur, so he told the story extremely well. So those of you who may have read the book, know that are familiar with what I'm talking about, that he was this, you know, he was an adventurous character himself who single-handedly took it upon himself to go out and find these ancient manuscripts that had been just kind of sort of dispersed through the deserts of Mali, and track them down and persuade these people to turn them over to him, bargaining, you know, gauging their value, then bringing them back to Timbuktu and hustling money from various sources to build libraries, including Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor, just kind of building up this incredible network of people. So it was a great story. I mean, it became better as I got deeper into the reporting, you know. And yeah.
I'm sorry. With the Egg Thief, you wrote an article first, so it was a bit different.
Yeah. So sometimes you want to test the waters, you know, and so that was, yeah. Let's start. I've written for Outside for many years, less now, but you know, it was a natural piece for them, and as soon as I told them about this idea, they went for it immediately. But even then, because I was, as I said earlier, that these elements just in that one article that mentioned, you know, sheikhs in Dubai, helicoptering to seize wild eggs, jumping bail from Brazil, globe-trotting career criminal in this esoteric profession. So, yeah, there was a lot of elements there that even as I was pitching it as a magazine piece, I thought this could be a book. But of course, the great problem here, as I started this whole thing, was that I just wasn't. I had no idea where the main character was. Well, first of all, let me back up. First of all, one main problem facing me before I got deeper into it was that I wasn't sure that a whole book could be, that people would want to read an entire book about a bad guy, a villain. You know, I mean, those stories kind of get old after a while, and I had a sense that there might be a sort of a repetitiveness to him running. So that's what my editor at Simon & Schuster was hesitant about. But then I quickly got the idea after a trip to Wales that Andy McWilliam, this ornithological policeman who pursued Landrum, would be like the natural hero. He's like the Tom Hanks guy in Catch Me If You Can, to a certain extent. Didn't have the same, like, you know, years-long pursuit. But as we say in this trade, with some smoke and mirrors, you can, you know, elevate a character into a heroic role. And so, yeah, he was a very appealing figure. And so I had my hero and I had my villain. The problem was Landrum was the main character going to talk to me? I had no idea going into this if I could get him. And I felt like if I couldn't, you know, that would be a pretty major gap in the narrative, not to have to have to report around. For a magazine piece, it's okay. For a 300-page book, you don't have your main character like present. You're really facing a serious obstacle. But I went into it just kind of, I got the contract to write the book even without knowing, you know, saying in the proposal something about, you know, I'm sure Landrum will, you know, make himself available. No doubt, you know. No idea whatsoever. As it turned out, you know, it was a gradual zeroing in kind of thing, and I did finally get him, and it did make a big difference. I didn't get him for a long period of time. I got him, you know, I met him for about 3 hours, and then I continued a phone conversation with him on and off over the course of 6 months, and between that, you know, the face-to-face contact and the phone conversations, it really did add a lot. I don't think it would have worked in retrospect had Landrum not been available. he not made himself available. But I am
Well,
pretty good at getting people to talk to me, you know, if I really set my mind to it. Yeah.
Yes, you are. And I think the other thing that makes these books a standout, and one of your recent reviewers in the Falcon Thief said this, is that you go and you actually retrace your subject's most ambitious trips to reconstruct them in breathless detail. What are you thinking when you do this? I'm
I
assuming
love doing
you
that. That's
take
my
notes.
favorite part of it. That's my favorite part of it. I have to say that, excuse me, I have to say that in the Lendrum book in particular, one of the, sorry, in my teeth, sorry about that. One of the great appealing things starting out the book was the fact that this guy had gone on this kind of worldwide odyssey over years to, you know, the Arctic. I didn't go there, too expensive. And you also have to deal with things like your book advance and your expenses of coming out of your book advance. So certain things are just crazy. I would have had to charter my own helicopter, and that was just a no-go zone. Patagonia, Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the cliffs of Wales, Zimbabwe, those were places I got to following his footsteps. And, you know, because I got to Lendrum finally and was able to persuade him actually to give me, you know, Patagonia is a big place. I was able to actually get Lendrum to give me the GPS points of these various nests that he robbed, of these, you know, these rare birds in this amazing landscape. So I could retrace his exact steps when I was down there. Otherwise, it would have kind of been a fool's errand. I mean, really, just to wander through where where do you go? But we were able to pin it down ahead of time. Talked
But
to
I know
Chilean naturalists, and they came with me, and it was great. So that was, like I said, that's like that. You know, in Zimbabwe, I did the same thing. That's where he was born. He grew up in Rhodesia, so that was his home turf, and I got to sort of see the world that he came out of. I know Zimbabwe well. I've been there many, many times over the years, but this particular trip. So I had a lot of background. This particular trip was just after Robert Mugabe fell, so that was a kind of an interesting political element as well. But being able to sort of see the world that he came out of and understand this obsession for live raptor eggs was really incredibly interesting and important for the story.
But you know, I know for you, it's not all rappelling down cliffs and chasing Al-Qaeda.
I didn't rappel down any cliffs.
An amount of time in the library.
Yeah, there's some of that. Yeah, that's a nice balance. Both of those books involved a mixture of going out and you know, well, the Timbuktu trip actually involved some serious risk, you know, but between that kind of gonzo journalism, call it whatever you want, and some, you know, rooting around in archives and spending time. I see Gary Chris is watching here, so he knows what I'm talking about. There is a great joy to rooting around in archives and finding this stuff, you know, that will enhance your story. I believe I like both of these books because they allowed me to kind of go back and forth and do both. I made many trips to the British Library, rooting through ancient tracts about falconry and finding just obscure things that, you know, even like a full 2 days in the library to find just a couple of paragraphs would be worth it, you know.
And you cover so much ground when you do that. The same reviewer said that Falcon Thief is, beside being a fast-moving narrative written to entertain, that you've woven in enough, I'll quote, hard-to-find literature to make it a valuable primer on oology, raptor biology, Rhodesia, Oriental falconry, and the birth of wildlife law enforcement in Britain.
Well, part of that comes from libraries, and part of it comes from interviews, you know, extensive interviews with all of the principals and people around them. Yeah. And it's not all running around to Patagonia. Yeah, there's a lot of time on the phone and a lot of time on the internet, and yeah.
Since these are nonfiction, how do you know when you're done, or how do you figure out what research to incorporate versus what winds up on the editor's floor?
That's a really good question. Sometimes you have to just cast a wide net. And a classic example of this was when I was beginning my work. I made I committed to giving myself 5 weeks in Mali, which is a long time actually to be in Mali, away from the family and in Mali, you know, not easy. So I went down there for the real serious research. And the first thing I did was go to the library and the archives in Bamako. And I spent like a good 2 weeks of this trip reading through original diaries in French from the late 19th century of the French conquest of Timbuktu, because I figured this is an untold story. And there were dramatic tales about these patrols going out and these Tuareg nomads, the ambushing them and leaving like one man, classic stories, one man alive. So really dramatic stuff. And I had a computer and I was sort of copying down the French or translating in my head. It was incredibly grueling work. And by the time that I finally got down and sat down to write, I had, math, and I was photocopying. I mean, it was incredible. I bring up a haul of this stuff. Two paragraphs in the book about the French conquest of Timbuktu. Almost nothing. So you don't really know until you sit down. You think that you've got this great stuff often, and then you end up discarding a vast amount of it. That was disheartening, but I realized that there was kind of no way. Once I kind of figured out exactly what the through line of the story was, I tried to, because it was, of course it's incredibly painful to give this stuff up that you put a lot of time into, but at some point you face you have to make the story that you're telling. I mean, all the facts have to kind of fit that story, and there was just no way to fit this. It was just this kind of detour that didn't mean it. It didn't add up. So you never know that when you're in the throes of reporting. You're just grabbing stuff. And to a certain extent, the Falcon Thief was the same way. There was a lot of extraneous material that didn't end up in the book.
Are you working with an outline that guides your research, or gives you at least a sense of where to dive in deep, or are you just following leads?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that with the thing about the Badass Librarians is that it didn't, and one of the problems with that one of the reasons I spent so much time with that French dead end cul-de-sac, was because I wasn't even clear when I went down there that Abdelkader Hyder was going to be my main character. I had actually a much more sweeping story involving like Malian music, which I was totally into at the time. There was this Malian impresario who's in the book, but much smaller role than he had originally. So it was going to be kind of like 3 characters or 4 characters. It didn't have a clear narrative line at all. And so therefore, that was one of the reasons I had to cast such a big net. With the Falcon Thief, it was clearly going to be, I had even going into it as things picked up momentum, I had a much clearer idea of what kind of material I needed in addition to sort of bolster the main narrative of cop and criminal and the kind of pas de deux these guys did through the years, So that in that respect, I kind of had a much more targeted approach when I went to the British Library, where I did most of my archival research on this. Yeah.
Well, and I noticed when you received the Pulitzer grant to write Timbuktu, music, manuscripts, and madness.
Yeah, exactly.
The Sahara was your title. How did you
right.
get Badass Librarians?
Yeah, good question. That was, I had some boring title like Taking Timbuktu, I think that was right, the original.
Yeah.
I handed in a manuscript, and a junior editor just kind of scribbled in the margins, about Abdelkader and his effort, what a bunch of badasses. And my editor, Priscilla Payton, wrote to me, it just instantly clicked for her that we got to call this the Badass Librarians of Timbuktu. And so it was her idea. And I wasn't quite sure. It wasn't really what I had been thinking of. It has sort of a Hunter Thompson-y or kind of puerile, I don't know, quality about it. But it kind of grew on me pretty quickly that if you're going to write about a place as remote as from Americans' concerns as Mali, you've got to grab them, from the title. And just the juxtaposition of Badass Librarians is so startling that I saw the wisdom of it. Yeah, but I didn't have anything to do with the choice. Yeah.
Now, both of these books, oddly enough, given the very, very different subject matters, are about both smuggling and hiding things and preservation. Are those two themes that just interest you, or is that coincidence?
I think both of them, yeah, are about, yeah, you're right, preservation. I kind of actually thought about that after I was into the Falcon, after I started getting into the Falcon Thief. That, I mean, Badass Librarians was just a good, you know, it was a good yarn. I mean, but obviously it had that, I mean, it's a story about, you know, it's kind of a morality play. It's kind of about, it's a great operation, a great scheme, but it's sort of in a positive way scheme. So that story just, you know, it's a chase, it's subterfuge, almost like saving, and then it has that underlay of saving the cultural patrimony, which gives you, you know, you really have, I mean, the reader has a real stake in it. So you have a heroic. So Falcon Thief was a little, I mean, I wasn't consciously thinking like I wanted to do something just like Badass, you know, but as I got further into it, I did try to frame it more. I needed to find a way to frame it so that readers would get into it more. So so that's why the character of Andy McWilliam, he's the preservationist. He's the guy who's out to save wildlife. You know, the other guy is, you know, he's the, I mean, parallels are there, but they're not as overt as you would think, you know, as maybe you're asking me about. But there's an element, there's a chase element. There's an element of you know, what's valuable in the world. We've got to fight to preserve that value. There are, you know, bad guys out there who are always trying for, you know, for egomaniacal reasons or pure malevolence to take away what's valuable in the world. Abdul Qadir is a protector. Andy McWilliam is a protector. It just so happens that in the Falcon Thief, the bad guy happens to be more, you know, he's, in a way, you know, he's the protagonist. But on the other hand, you know, he's the Abdul Qadir, but he's kind of like the negative image of Abdul Qadir. He's,
you know, one of the things,
charismatic character, but he's also a son of a, you know, an asshole.
so you have badasses and assholes. You know, one of the things in the Falcon Thief, though, for me, the Falcons become sort of a hero of the story as well. And you write with, I think, a great deal of empathy about them. Did you feel that way about birds and falcons beforehand, or has it changed?
Nah, not particularly. I had no knowledge of falconry whatsoever. I always found it kind of, I don't know, actually I find falconry a bit distasteful, you know, watching birds tear other birds to pieces, never particularly grabbed me. I do like birds. I mean, I you know, remember these trips. I write about it a little bit in the book, and traveling through the marshes of Iraq and being just amazed at the variety of the bird life there. And Martha's Vineyard, where I go every summer, is just a wonderful bird paradise. And when I was in Africa as a correspondent, one of the great things I like to do was go up to the Rift Valley lakes and watch fish eagles and fly, you know, amazing birds, you know, darting like missiles into the water. And so I always had an appreciation for that. And falcons in the same way, maybe not falcons under the control of man, but just falcons in the wild, or, you know, hawks in the wild are just wonderful to watch. Like eagles, they're just impressive, noble, powerful birds. So yeah, I was that appealed to me. And of course I thought, but not in a particularly, you know, obsessive Jonathan Franz and John James Audubon kind of way, just as something to appreciate. And then of course it was just a question of, well, if you're going to write about falconry, write about a falcon thief, you have to let the reader, you have to communicate to a certain extent what's incredible about those birds. So that took a bit of research, but you know, I didn't want to go overboard with the bird thing. I wanted to, because I really wanted this to be a human story. But you have to know what's at stake, and so it was important for me to get, you know, certainly a sense of, you know, a bit of ornithology, and a bit of biology, a bit of cultural history, you know, the sort of, you know, millennia-long fascination for falcons. I wanted to get into that. I had to get into that a little bit without boring the reader. Because I'm not writing, I wasn't writing a bird watching manual, right? So you had to kind of figure out just give them the right amount,
You mentioned a couple of authors just now. Any authors who were big influences on you as you developed in your career?
Yeah, not necessarily for these particular books, but I love, I have a handful of narrative nonfiction writers who I'll read anything by. We don't necessarily operate in the same field, the same genre, but Eric Larson, he's just like a universally beloved nonfiction writer who just he's quite different from the kind of stuff I do, but I just admire his work tremendously. I just picked up the new Winston Churchill book he wrote, and just read finally his book Thunderstruck about Marconi, Devil in the White City. He just everything he writes is golden. Who else do I put in that category? Hampton Sides, for those of you who know Hampton Sides, is a former Outside magazine writer who writes these kind of, he really does these adventure tales. They tend to be archival adventure tales. Kingdom of Ice, about an incredible late 19th century journey through the Arctic, people who were Americans who were stranded there in the ice and had to fight their way out for months in unbelievable conditions. He writes these really, it was his first book. Ghost Soldiers was the first book he wrote about an escape from a prisoner of war camp in Southeast Asia during World War II. Just these really kind of enthralling, great narrators. Mark Bowden, author of Black Hawk Down, another one whose work I read, and David Gran, who people might know from, why am I forgetting the titles? The huge
Killing Fields of the Flower Moon.
Well, yes, exactly. And the one before that about the 19th century explorer who vanishes in South America. Why is the name escaping me? But does the same kind of, just knows how to tell a great enthralling yarn. Writes cinematically, incredible sense of pacing, character driven, character driven. That's what this stuff is all about. If you don't have a great character, you're not going to draw in a reader. So that's essential. Yeah. So there's a lot of elements.
Well, and talking about characters too, you mentioned earlier how you had to find Jeff Lundgren and get him to trust you. What I found even more amazing is the trust and empathy that you seem to have built up with the characters beyond even Abdul Qadir in Timbuktu, because these were people who, as you vividly describe, whose lives were in danger every day, who had no reason to trust anyone. How did you build that rapport?
Well, in Timbuktu, it's like just simply showing up, these people had been through, they'd been through a jihadist occupation for almost a year. The world had kind of moved on. And I showed up there, my first trip post-jihad in August 2013. I don't know how many, if any, Western reporters had gone up to Timbuktu. One of the things that I have done in the past as a foreign correspondent, as a magazine writer, is to go to a place after the world has moved on, I started doing that actually in Rwanda when I was with Newsweek, going going into a town that had been just horrifically destroyed during the genocide, and a story that had not been told. People were looking elsewhere. They were looking at the sort of the next stage. The world had passed it by. Genocide had happened. The story had been written. One of the advantages of the kind of work I do is that you have the freedom to kind of go back. So I went to this town, Butare, in southern Rwanda, and spent 2 weeks there and met people and reconstructed the events there. And of course, people are just gratified to tell their stories because maybe they feel ignored, maybe they just have had this horrible trauma. Enough time has passed so that they feel maybe a little more able to talk about it. And it was similar in Timbuktu 25 years later. I mean, these people had been through hell. They'd seen, people getting their hands chopped off in front of them, banning music, I mean, just the daily oppression of jihadist life under jihadi rule, and they wanted to talk. And so I would show up in these people's houses and with my translator, or not with it, or by myself, because I speak French. And I just got great stories. People just told great stories, So it wasn't like any kind of magical, charm on my part. It was just like being in the right place at the right time. So, can't hear you. You have gone dead. I have lost. You're back. You're back.
Okay. I don't know what happened there. I'm going to follow up on with some questions from our audience Q&A now. And Diane Edelman asks one that I think is a good follow on.
Yeah.
You've been in some scary or dangerous situations as a journalist and possibly as a book author. How do you prepare yourself to possibly face danger as you follow your stories?
So I have not really been in a dangerous place in about, it's been about, I want to say Timbuktu was probably the last place, 2014, that stuff also gets old, I'm trying to think about that trip. Well, that was actually a very hair-raising journey. I had to travel to Timbuktu to get these stories about the jihad, about the occupation. The only way to get those stories would be to reach the city, which there were no planes going in. The jihadis were surrounding the city. I mean, there was this that peacekeeping force, photo of which I showed you earlier. Was pretty much the thin blue line separating Timbuktu from being overrun again. And I had to get overland, about 200 miles through the desert, semi-desert, with no clue, with no military presence. Could only hope that there were no jihadis around, but no guarantees. So I don't know. It's like I had my heart in my throat the whole trip. It was like a 5-6 hour journey, and I had a Tuareg scarf wrapped around my head, and I was sunk low in the seat. And I had, just a wing and a prayer. I had to not only do that, I had to do that again. I came back a few months later, and because I had to gather more information. I had to do the same damn trip. It wasn't any safer then. I had to make the same trip by road. Fortunately, both times I was able to fly out of there on a UN flight. One flight, they weren't taking any passengers, but somebody or other managed to pay the right person and get me. I was the only person flying back on this plane. But it did save me the stress of having to come back on the same road that I had come up on. So, I don't know how I prepare for that. I try to disguise myself. I'd be as inobtrusive as possible. I make decisions like it was suggested that I have a military escort to get up to Timbuktu, like to pay a huge amount of money and have 2 jeeps of soldiers escort me. But it was pointed out by somebody else up there that maybe that would not be such a good idea because that might draw attention and an ambush. Maybe the best thing to do would just be to go in unobtrusively, hiding in the back seat, duck low in the back seat for 8 hours. And so I weighed these ideas. I went back and forth in my head about this, and I think ultimately, like the fact that my advance wasn't so great, I didn't feel like throwing a couple $1,000s at some some dubious Malian soldiers. It just seemed like, okay, I'll go for Plan B, the cheaper, unobtrusive approach, and it worked.
Well, I can tell you can feel the tension. I felt the tension reading about it, so I
don't do these things really anymore. I know that was, I said, like the last one of those. Yeah, I don't have any desire anymore.
So we have a question from Mary Beckman. What are you working on now or next? Can you give us a bit of a preview?
Yeah, well, I'm in that period where in between projects where I'm just casting around. I've got a couple of ideas. There's something I don't want to really talk openly about it. There's something it's also very hard in the Corona era to move. So, and much of what I do involves moving. But there is something in Paris that has sparked my interest. And so I'm hopefully in the next couple of weeks going to be able to get over to Paris and meet these gendarmes and investigators on a particular story of interest. I don't know if it's a book, but I'll find out more in a couple of weeks. So yeah, I'm just casting around. I'm also thinking, this adventure nonfiction genre. I don't necessarily want to be doing that in the next, 5 years from now either. So maybe it's time to move. I do debate whether or not I should go full time into archival work. Find just a great historical story. I've done that once. It's not totally foreign to me. I did a book in 2006. I had lived in Japan, did Princeton in Asia after college, and I'd been through an earthquake there, and I learned the father of my girlfriend at the time, stepfather, had actually been through the great 23 earthquake that destroyed Tokyo and Yokohama, completely forgotten. But that's what sort of stayed in my mind. So in 2006, actually from 2004 to 2006, I did a full deep dive archival history book, going through the archives, libraries, ancient old letters, going to Yokohama and hanging out there for a month. And I could see going back to doing something like that. Sometimes it feels like every one of these stories has already been told. It's hard to find those archival stories that have not been told, but I know they're out there.
So I think actually, thanks to Kristen Fisher for asking this a question about whether or not you were doing research now under COVID travel restrictions. I think we hit that one. A question for Prentice Hall about your 2006 book, Yokohama Burning. Can you say more about how you did the research for that book and any nuggets that were left out of the final work?
That's been a long time to remember the nuggets that were left out. So I can't really think of anything right at the top of my head. But as I said, this research involved. I was really fortunate to go to Timbuktu, Yokohama, and meet. I had a very great translator fixer who found for me, a 94-year-old survivor of that earthquake who had very vivid memories. I was able to sort of begin the book with him and weave his stories, his real, like first-person account. Weave his into this, what was otherwise a purely archival work. There's also like an incredible also Japan in the 1920s, early 20s had a great, huge English expat community there. And they had a couple of excellent English language dailies and weeklies, and including one published like in Kobe. And they had incredible reporting on the earthquake. And so I basically just planted myself in Yokohama for a couple of weeks for a month in their archive. And, just amass an amazing amount of material, not even needing a translator. It was just great English language reporting. And then I had, my Japanese assistant helping me find Japanese sources. But it was like, heavy duty rooting around. And then back in the States, I was able to find more, it just snowballs, one thing leads to another, and you start tracking down all of these first person accounts that have been stashed away. The Boston Athenaeum Library. When I was a Neiman Fellow, I would go there. They had some great old accounts from 1923 that had never been looked at in 80 years. So that was, satisfying in a very different non-adventure way. Except trip to Japan, it was fun. It was, but not a great adventure.
So I've got a comment that was in chat from Wendy Curran, and I apologize if I've gotten the last name wrong, that I'm going to read. And Wendy says, Josh, I really love Badass Librarians, not only as a great story, but also for your ability to present the variety of practices of Islam in different times and places. The extremists of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Boko Haram have gotten so much attention in the last decade. Reading about other sects and value systems was illuminating and even healing. Since it's such a politically charged subject, did you have an intention to expose the more complex aspects deliberately, or did this just unfold naturally?
Well, I mean, I think there were some people who wanted this to be a totally, just a book about, you know, this great escape, you know, this great smuggling operation, and like, you know, sort of not really get deeply into the question of Islam and the different kinds of Islam that prevailed in Timbuktu over the years in the battle between extremist Wahhabi Islam and the Sufi Islam of Northern Africa. But, you know, I just felt, I felt what happened in 2012 was an echo of what had happened in that part of the world and in that country several times over the centuries, and that it would be worth, you know, diving deeply into that. Just as I felt it would be worth talking a bit about the, you know, sort of identifying the three jihadist leaders and giving and fleshing them out as real characters. So it wasn't just this total. So Abu Qadir wasn't the only character, but that you had some, you know, faces and personalities behind the, you know, the extremism and the evil. So that's kind of, it kind of evolved, you know, as I was doing the reporting.
So Greg Cullison has a question, given that we talked about the fact this is a nonfiction story, so you don't know when it will end, but at what point in your project do you put together a dramatic structure, the story arc?
Yeah, so that, it just kind of, I think as you are reporting, it's simultaneous with the research that you're doing. You're kind of, I don't know, maybe every writer does it differently. For me, it's the structure kind of follows the research. At some point along the line, I've gathered enough material, and also, of course, you know, the structure kind of also, it works both ways. The structure can sort of define the research that you kind of have an idea in your head and you realize you need to bolster it with this kind of stuff or that kind of stuff. It's just like a symbiotic process. It all works. It's not like you just gather all the information, randomly sweeping it all up and then sitting down and trying to figure out how to put it together. It happens simultaneously in a kind of serendipitous way that I can't really describe. But you know, you kind of know, it also involves a lot of trial and error. Certain things don't work. You have to figure out how to, you know, the most compelling way to tell a story. And often that involves a lot of trial and error. I mean, in the case of Falcon Thief, for instance, I wrote a magazine piece first, and I had a natural magazine lead. And when I actually sat down to write the book, I was determined not to begin the book with the same. I felt I needed to do something more, I had to be original, come up with a different way of beginning the book. So I fooled around, wasted a month, and then realized, no, in fact, I should have trusted my instincts. The compelling way to do this would be to begin exactly, just kind of an expanded 3-chapter version of the way the Falcon, my magazine story began. And once that problem had been solved, everything else just kind of fell into place. Yeah, because in that book, that was essentially, so I began that book with these two characters. This was the beginning of the book unfolded in 2010, when the guy gets arrested in Birmingham Airport and he meets the police, ornithological policeman, for the first time. And they have this fairly charged, you know, emotional, well, just charged encounter. And then the story sort of branches off so that you have these two characters, parallel lives, and you sort of follow along until they meet again. And then so it kind of, you have two characters meeting, and then you go back in time, following it along until much later in the book, they converge. So you have this almost full circle structure. It all you just kind of feel your way through it.
When you do make good use of both prologues and epilogues in your book, is that a decision you make at the end to kind of clean up, or is it a mechanism you use to get started?
Yeah. So in the Badass Librarians, I had an original I think the book originally began just with Abdul Qadir. The first line was something like, Abdul Qadir was a young boy when he first learned about the mysteries of Timbuktu. That was like the first line of chapter 1. But I realized that wasn't necessarily going to grab a reader immediately. I thought it was a good chapter, but so then I realized, no, I'm going to need something that is going to set up the tension and the stakes and the drama, like before I get into Abdul Qadir, so that people are waiting. So the logical place to begin then was, well, what was the moment of greatest tension in this story? And it was where his nephew, I didn't even identify him as a nephew, there was the first smuggling operation where he was bringing these manuscripts out of Timbuktu, hidden in the back of his car, and he hits his first jihadi checkpoint. And he's already been arrested once for hiding books in the city. So he's completely terrified, but he's trying desperately to keep calm. And he knows that if the books are found, anything could happen. And so in the course of it was just like a 750 word opening scene that establishes Timbuktu, jihadists, the manuscripts, the tension. There's some kind of operation going on here to get these books out. We don't know really what it's about, why the jihadis are here. It's just a moment of fear and tension to get you hooked. And then boom, chapter 1 begins. Abdul Qadir Hyder was a young boy when he first heard about the mysteries of Timbuktu. So just that little, italicized opening, 2 pages, 3 pages maybe, and it kind of clicked into place. So it's.
This reader thought it was very, very effective, both.
There you go.
And thrilling.
And yeah, Falcon Thief was a bit different. I felt I needed a prologue. I don't know. I went back. Should I talk about that too? I mean, I felt like, yep. Okay, so that story begins. The real tale begins in this Emirates Airlines first-class lounge in Birmingham with this very suspicious janitor who notices this guy just doing something just acting a little odd. This is Lendrum, who was later caught an hour later by the counterterrorism police smuggling 15 live falcon eggs, which he's hiding on his body, alerted by this janitor. But so that the story, it could have worked like that, just boom, right into that, there was something odd about this, about this guy, thinks janitor John Struczynski. But I felt like I needed a little bit of another short prologue to introduce that scene. It wouldn't tell you anything. And it really was about me and my kind of how I developed an ornithological, a love of birds. Very short, but just to sort of capture the mystery and the beauty of birds. Very quick. Also bringing up Lendrum a little bit, sort of hinting at what was to come. And then boom, once you get past that quickly, then you're into the real story. So it functioned in a different way.
So Bob Tushman writes that your research and reporting for these books is so impressive and would like to know what the timeline from starting research to publication is, and whether you take on other work during what he assumes is a long process.
Yeah, it's hard for me to do both, to do anything else. Sometimes it feels like anything I do that's not book related when I take this on is like is a distraction. and I don't feel like I'm capable of concentrating the way I want to when I take on. But sometimes, you know, I have to for financial reasons. But with The Falcon Thief, I started that book when I was in. So the timeline there was I was in Hampstead with my kids in London when I read that article about this crazy character, and got intrigued. That was in January 2017. In March 2017, I set off to Wales, got the magazine piece, met the wildlife cop, Andy McWilliam. A month later, turned that into a book project. So then it was like the rest of 2017, all of 2018, started to write. Lendrum was captured again and went on trial in early 2019. I had to go up to London to attend that. And then it was like from January 2019 to mid 2019, I wrote the book. So, you know, to like 2 years, and then it takes like, sometimes it took Simon & Schuster almost, you know, 9 more months before it actually came out as a book. So all in all, you know, from start to, you know, from first seeds of an idea until the book is actually physically done, it was about 3 years.
Wow. And during that time, Kristen Fisher has a question. How do you organize your information? She says she's thinking about John McPhee and his Post-it notes all over the walls, but your home there looks pretty well organized. I don't have any notes.
I don't have it posted on my windows. That's right in front of me, but that would spoil the view. I have a very nice view. So no, I just have, it's not a great system. I just have various transcripts and files. It's really a shamefully disorganized system. But where I just keep going back and consulting various files, and I mean, you know, things are just jumbled together. But then I do have like sort of a key, sort of on a heart printed out, that gives me a guide of where I can find each bit of information in the 500,000 total words of file, like 25 different files. So it's not complete chaos. I have this key which tells me, you know, this will be in file X, this character talking about this. So that involves a certain amount of organization. And then I can sort of, now it's time for that. So I can find that in this. Now I'll go, you know, onto my computer and look for that particular bit of information, and, you know, weave it together like that. Post-its are probably a better approach, but it's just worked for me. It's worked for me.
How did you deal with the fact that in some of the interviews you said you used a translator, and I assume you tape as well, but that's still
always tape. I always tape. I hate writing. I mean, I used to write, but I mean that was when I was on like Newsweek deadlines, and I wasn't going to go back to my hotel and transcribe. I just had to scribble in notebooks. But with the leisure of book writing, you know, it's just great to be liberated from that. So yeah, I always use my iPhone or digital, sort of a good luck digital tape recorder I've had since 2008. And then I do find time to transcribe, you know, whenever I can. Sometimes on the road. And then why am I telling you this again?
Well, that's got to be complicated by the fact that people were speaking Arabic and you used
the translation issue. It just makes the transcription process, just draws it out a bit. Yeah. I speak French, as I said, and most of my reporting in Mali was in French. So that speeded it up. And, you know, in Paris, I had to do some serious French reporting in Paris too. Much easier to interview Africans speaking French if you're not a native French speaker than it is, you know, French military guys, foreign legionnaires, you know, speaking French. Yeah, real foreign, like officers. The officers of the French Foreign Legion are French. You know, that's tough. That's really tough. But African French, for some reason, I've never had a problem with. Abdul Qadir and I spent 14 hours together, as I told you. And you know, and it was pretty tiring, but I got, you know, 100% of what he was saying.
So I've got a series of questions from Alyssa Nelson, who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali in the mid-90s near Mopti. And she's asking, I'll list these first and then you can take them. Your impression of Malian views of Americans being in Mali, and how did that change between, if at all, between the 1990s and 2013, and how it affects your approach as a researcher and writer. And she's also interested in what you can say about your presence as an outsider, and specifically as an American, and whether that was helped or hurt by the presence of French colonials, foreign diplomats, etc.
Yeah, well, I would say that, I mean, Americans are sort of not totally relevant to the Malian experience. So unlike the French, I mean, the French are the ones that, you know, I don't know, we're symbols of whatever we were, symbols of, you know, democracy and, you know, privilege and wealth. And I think the Peace Corps has probably had a very positive role there. So, but it really, we are fairly, I don't know, we're not as consequential as the French are. The French, they have very complicated relationship with, especially over the last few, you know, the whole jihad thing. I mean, well, first of all, the French invaded the country, looted a lot of the manuscripts, looted a lot of the country, you know, ruled not so greatly for many years. And then the invasion of Libya, by which Sarkozy in 2011 pushed very hard for, destabilized the region, led to blowback, led to the jihadi takeover of Mali. That was a very French thing, you know, so very complicated feelings. I mean, compared to the Americans. The Americans we had a training program, military training. They mostly see the Americans, I'd say, in terms of, I don't know, I mean, our real engagement with Mali has been as military trainers, you know. The Malians, especially in the north, see Americans as soldiers who were there, special forces training the inept Malian army to fight, which they didn't end up fighting well. So, yeah, and I'm trying to think if I felt anything. I don't know. As an American working in Mali, I never really felt like my Americanness was an issue somehow. It didn't really come up much. It was I was just more seen as a foreigner, as an outsider. My American identity was not as perhaps as you know, in your face as had I been a French journalist. It would have been a different experience.
So final question as we close here. You have a movie coming out about badass librarians.
I don't.
No one plays Josh Hammer in the film?
No, it's a kind of a glossy documentary. It was shot in Timbuktu clandestinely, and also recreated scenes in Morocco by a pretty well-known documentary filmmaker. It's one of those films that's using, you know, interviews plus recreated scenes, like they recreated the jihadi takeover of Mali in Morocco. They couldn't do it in Timbuktu. They actually wanted to do it in Timbuktu, but the idea of like driving through the desert flying black jihadi flags did not go down well with the peacekeepers. They nixed that one, so they went and did it in Morocco. I have only seen a tiny bit of it, like a trailer. I've not really been in touch with the producer. Coronavirus, obviously, I don't know, has stalled the release of it. I don't really know. I haven't had a word of a conversation since November, when they were really excited about it and about to enter it into festivals and stuff, and called the Badass Librarians of Timbuktu. So maybe it will come out once this whole thing is over. I don't know. I'm puzzled, frankly.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for taking your time out and spending your morning with us. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and for those who asked questions. And thank you also to our producer, Neil Batuin from the Princeton Entrepreneurship School, who was terrific. And so everyone enjoy the rest of Reunions 2020. The class of 79, stay tuned for the virtual P-Raid today at 2. Hosted by our own Gary King. And then also tune in tonight at 7 for Ram Haiti's concert coming to us with Richard Morris from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. So thanks again, Josh.
That's cool. I'll watch
Take care.
that. Take care. Bye-bye.